Something horrible recently occurred to the U.S. economy, and Donald Trump is lying about who's paying for it. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York today revealed statistics indicating that Americans, not foreign nations, paid roughly 90% of Trump's tariffs in 2025. That is $287 billion stolen from U.S. people and companies, while the president frequently claimed foreigners were bearing the tab. This is the greatest U.S. tax hike since 1993. And every major economic agency is now confirming the same conclusion. Trump's trademark program is a direct wealth transfer from American households to the federal government, disguised as economic nationalism. I'm L of House of YouTube. I have a PhD in computer science, and I utilize data analysis to discover trends in geopolitics and economics, with a Federal Reserve paper that goes beyond mere policy disagreement. The mechanism at work here is persistent deception about who pays economic consequences, underpinned by data manipulation that parallels trends seen throughout Trump's whole economic program. Here's the background most analysts are missing, in my view. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York produced a study utilizing Census Bureau data through November 2025, indicating Americans paid 94% of tariff expenses from January through August, 92% from September through October, and 86% in November. The average U.S. tariff rate grew from 2.6% to 13% throughout 2025. If foreign corporations were absorbing these expenses, as Trump alleges, their export prices would have declined to keep final pricing consistent in U.S. markets. But instead, foreign producers scarcely altered prices, allowing U.S. importers and consumers to shoulder the whole penalty. Meanwhile, Trump has spent months asserting the complete opposite. In a January 30th Wall Street Journal op-ed, he said, and I'm quoting here, "The data shows that the burden or incidence of the tariffs has fallen overwhelmingly on foreign producers and middlemen, including large corporations that are not from the U.S." On the campaign road in September 2024, he assured supporters directly, and this is another statement, "It's not going to be a cost to you. It's going to be a cost to another country." The New York Fed study is not an exception. The Tax Foundation estimates that tariffs cost the typical family in the U.S. $1,000 in 2025 and would cost $1,300 in 2026. So it's growing, reflecting a tax rise of 0.54% of GDP, the biggest since 1993. Harvard Business School's tariff tracker showed the charges contributed 0.76 percentage points to the Consumer Price Index. The Kiel Institute estimated overseas exporters absorbed just 4% of tariff expenses, leaving 96% to American customers. Cross-referencing these separate evaluations demonstrates a universal accord across organizations with varied methodology and political viewpoints. When the Federal Reserve, Tax Foundation, Harvard scholars, German think tanks, and the Congressional Budget Office all reach the same findings using independent data sets, the pattern becomes unmistakable. It's a fact. At this stage, the financial procedures are clear. When the U.S. government sets a 25% tariff on imported steel, American firms importing that steel pay the levy to U.S. Customs. Those firms confront a choice: absorb the expense and diminish their own profit margins, or pass it on to customers via increased pricing. General Motors reported a $1.1 billion earnings damage from tariffs in mid-2025. Procter & Gamble announced price hikes for home items, including diapers and cosmetics. The association between tariff installation and consumer price rises is direct, quantitative, and has been for a while. According to official inflation figures, home furniture and supplies grew 3.8% from January 2025 to January 2026. Furniture and bedding costs grew 4%, dishes and flatware rose 5%, cleaning supplies and toilet paper rose 5%, and apparel jumped 14%. These are not abstract statistics. They reflect lower purchasing power for U.S. households buying basic needs. For more research on detecting when official narratives vary from economic reality, I suggest my book, Awake: The Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Self-Lies, accessible in ebook and audiobook forms. Subscribers receive 10% discount, plus you may view the first chapter for free using the links in the description. The methodology helps find regular patterns in how economic costs become allocated and concealed. The second-order consequences, however, ripple across the whole economy. The Yale Budget Lab estimated the current 16.9% average tariff rate is the highest since 1932, imposing a $1,151 loss per average household, while reducing GDP growth by 0.4 percentage points and pushing unemployment up 0.6 percentage points, eliminating approximately 1.3 million jobs by the end of 2025. The Congressional Budget Office anticipated firms would transfer 70% of tariff costs straight to consumers, while absorbing the other 30% via decreased profits. When you examine economic systems, you learn to spot these feedback loops. American firms paying taxes on imported components become less competitive against international competitors who obtain the identical components tariff-free. U.S. corporations must accept lesser profitability or increase prices and lose market share. It's a really difficult decision. Either consequence diminishes American manufacturing capability compared to rivals operating under different cost frameworks. Consider what this implies for international competitiveness. Canadian and European firms selling to their home markets or dealing inside existing free trade zones don't face Trump's levies. An Ontario-based business, for example, sourcing Japanese components and selling to European consumers, runs in a completely different cost environment than a Michigan rival importing the identical Japanese parts. The American corporation pays 13% average tariffs that the Canadian rival avoids totally. If you want to see how this pattern of economic self-sabotage goes beyond tariffs, check out my recent video on how Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been urgently pleading for foreign investment while American economic credibility fades. I'm going to link it in the description. The association is direct. Policies that raise expenses for American enterprises undermine the attractiveness of U.S. market participation. The legal risk here adds another layer. The Supreme Court is presently examining whether Trump's emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, i.e. EPA, include jurisdiction to impose tariffs. Lower courts have previously decided these moves exceeded presidential power. If the Supreme Court knocks down the tariffs, the federal government might owe firms as much as $168 billion in reimbursements, according to the University of Pennsylvania. Historical experience suggests that when governments impose major economic expenses while consistently misrepresenting who suffers those costs, trust loss increases once the difference between rhetoric and reality becomes evident. And we're at that stage, in my view, right now. Trump developed his tariff plan on the express promise that other nations would pay. 5 distinct institutes using various techniques now agree American households paid over 90% of the expense. The data tampering goes beyond tariffs. For commentary on how the Trump administration has been caught lying about job figures and even terminating federal staff who altered data contradicting official narratives, check my latest video. I'm going to link it in the description as well. The trend is identical. Short-term political messaging, damaging long-term institutional legitimacy. What happens now, I suppose, depends on whether American people perceive the wealth shift. The Treasury Department collected $287 billion in tariffs in 2025, up 192% from the previous year. That money comes largely from American people and corporations, not foreign governments. The typical American household is $100 to $300 poorer in 2026 because of initiatives Trump said wouldn't cost them anything. The immediate economic effect is diminished consumer spending power at a moment when the government concurrently claims to be rebuilding the economy. The long-term effect, however, is institutional trust loss when the Federal Reserve, Congressional Budget Office, Tax Foundation, and academic institutions all reject the president's stated statements using publicly accessible facts. It presents a straightforward choice: believe independent analysis or trust political propaganda. From a competitive positioning viewpoint, American firms currently operate under cost structures 13 percentage points higher than baseline owing to tariff costs that Trump stated foreigners would be paying. Every rival in Canada, Europe, or Asia not subject to the same expenses obtains a relative edge. The feedback loop is self-reinforcing. Higher costs, lower competitiveness, which reduces market share, which reduces revenue available for investment, which further erodes competitive positions. The Wall Street Journal highlighted in a February 13th editorial, and I'm quoting here, "No matter how often President Trump insists his tariffs are taxing foreigners to enrich the U.S., economic studies keep showing that Americans actually pay the bill." When even historically conservative organizations directly reject presidential promises, the gap between rhetoric and economic reality becomes hard to ignore. Trump's tariffs mark the greatest tax hike in 3 decades, funded nearly completely by U.S. households. While the president regularly says foreigners pay the burden, 5 significant organizations corroborate the same results using independent data. The mechanism is not complicated. It is a blatant wealth transfer camouflaged as economic nationalism. For more on how American economic confidence is crumbling under these systemic credibility flaws, check out the movie on your screen right now assessing the larger trend of deteriorating faith in U.S. institutional stability. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.